Welcome back to the class, everyone. When it comes to modding in Galaxy of Heroes, the best stat by an overwhelming margin has to be speed. And while the best place to get the speed is typically by using a 30 speed arrow, there is a group of characters out there that actually want another stat even more. So that's really the whole point of today's video, is I want to take apart and look at 25 different characters that actually want another stat on their primary for their arrow even more than speed. And this is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but I thought of 25 options, so we're going to go over 25 options. Before we get started, I do want to make one small disclaimer about what this video is not. This video is not an excuse for me to say that everyone out there needs to have a bunch of arrows with a 25 plus speed secondary so that they can start putting another stat like crit avoidance or health on their primary. The whole point of today's video is to be on the lookout for other primaries that are not speed for your speed arrow, because there are characters that are genuinely willing to take a 10, 15, 20, sometimes even 30 speed hit because they want that other stat so badly. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into our first stat, which is health. And Doc is kind of an obvious choice, so I'm kind of using this for a lot of people out there who are already aware of it, just to get a notion of what we're going for. You can see here I have a health primary on my Doc with only 10 speed, and that is by far worth it for me because Doc overall, she uses her health in a great way, not only to survive, but it's also her revive or her heal is based off of it. And then in addition to that, she genuinely doesn't need a lot of the speed, because one of the whole mechanics with the OG Night Sister team is that she will be gaining a lot of turn meter whenever another ally is defeated. So we don't necessarily need the speed to be there to make it up. So a great example of a character who doesn't necessarily want a speed arrow and instead wants a health. Another great example is going to be our good friend Jolie. Jolie, again, is very much in that survivability route. He is the reviver for the team, so if he goes down, then nobody can be revived. And I will say, there are a lot of people who are still running crit avoidance on him, and I would really argue against that, because when you actually look at his unique, it says that he's already transferring his tenacity into crit avoidance, and he's getting 100% from the unique alone. So if you just have like a very simple set and a very simple primary on him for tenacity, you get him to over 200% after you factor in his unique, which is half that would be 100% crit avoidance. So for overall bulk, we really want to be going for the primary on his arrow and health, because he's already getting enough crit avoidance from his unique ability, surviving more, reviving your Jedi Reverend, your Jedi Master Luke, or whoever it is. Next up is actually going to be Wampa. And Wampa, you could probably even group SWGOH into this kind of grouping too, but for a very similar reason. The guy really needs to survive, and he does get a lot of boost once you look at his GAC Omicron to his health, and then not only is going to use that health as health, but is going to take it and actually turn it into protection up on his special ability as well. And then in a very similar fashion to Daka, he doesn't need copious amounts of speed from a speed arrow, because he is going to have a lot of turn meter gains from when he is going in and encountering when he's not debuffed and when the enemy's debuffed, because he has a bunch of dots as well as a ton of tenacity from the Grand Arena Omicron. Next up is going to be Vander Chewbacca. Vander Chewbacca kind of is in a similar position to Jolie that we talked about earlier, but mostly he's just a few uniques on a stick. And I don't mean that as an insult. He's actually a very good few uniques on a stick. He has the ability to revive all of his allies whenever he's prepared, and Dash pretty much makes sure that happens all the time, especially with his Omicron. And then in addition to that, I feel like this is not something that a lot of newer players are aware of. While he's active, all enemies deal 25% less damage while he's buffed, which that's a really big deal, because that's not just to him, that's the entire enemy team. So basically, we need to make sure that he doesn't die. And he doesn't necessarily need to take turns to do whatever it is that his basic does, and he doesn't actually need active turns to revive like Jolie does. So again, he's very much fine having that 16% health, and we really don't want to go the protection route, because, I mean, he kind of ditches that for himself. So overall, more max health, more survivability, the more your team gets to survive. Royal Guard, he's a really good tank under Lord Vader, and he gets a lot of his taunt from what Lord Vader is already doing in his kit. He doesn't necessarily need to take turns to make that happen, and with how the order of operations for stat works out, health ends up being better for him than protection under the Lord Vader lineup, even though Lord Vader converts his protection over to health. It's kind of an overwhelming interaction, so we're not going to go into it. Overall, he's just a character that doesn't necessarily need to take turns and is completely fine with that. In a very similar vein is going to be both GK and crew for pretty much the exact same reason. They have very sticky taunts, especially when they're under JMK as well as Supreme Leader Kylo Ren, both through advantage or protection up respectively. So they don't necessarily, again, need to take turns. They really just need to make sure they don't die, and having a health primary is a big deal, especially when you realize General Kenobi's protection up, similar to Wampa, is built off of that health. Next up is Barriss, again, a character that just doesn't need to take a lot of turns. At the end of each turn, Barriss dispels all debuffs from the weakest enemy ally and gains 10% turn meter for each buff removed. So she's going to be gaining a lot of turns just on her own from cleansing. And again, similar to Jolie and Vandor, her main goal is to just not die. She doesn't necessarily even need to get back to those turns to do anything. Next up is going to be Grievous, a very different character from any of the ones we've talked about so far. He's not a reviver. He's not a tank. He literally just is going to pull all of his damage instead of from his offense, from his max health, which is a really big deal because he's one of the bigger damage dealers on his team. So it pretty much leaves you in a situation where, again, you're willing to easily sacrifice 15, 20 speed to make sure you get that health primary, because a health secondary really won't ever get close, and you'll be leaving a lot of damage and survivability on the table at the same time. Next up is going to be Cal Kestis, a character that in a lot of circumstances actually does want to be slower just because of how him and Seer's kit were built. And if you're using him on array, it's always nice when he stays in damage immunity longer. Again, a character that's really only goal is to try to survive so that he can help the team out. So that is going to cover health. Again, not an exhaustive list. If you can think of another character, feel free to comment them in the comment section below. So next up is going to be a little bit more niche. We're going to talk about crit avoidance. And crit avoidance, it's a good stat. The big problem with it, why it's not going to be on as many characters as, say, health, is because most characters don't gain enough crit avoidance from the arrow to actually stop a lot of counters. What we need to be looking for, and it's true of all 5 characters on the screen right now, is some other dynamic in their kit, whether it be a leadership or unique or another character, where they're already getting some form of crit avoidance. Malgus is a really good example of this in GAC, not really so much anywhere else, where in his leadership ability, he will be giving 80% critical avoidance to his team. This is a really big deal, especially when you consider gas critting not is only going to be more damage versus Malgus, but it's also going to be increasing cooldowns. So if you're at 80% critical avoidance and you put a critical avoidance arrow on top of that, you're sitting at a very nice, 115% chance, which is going to help curb out that gas counter a lot, and the other counter that wants to crit. In the very similar vein, L3, if you look in her unique, which she'll be able to cycle through these pretty quickly, she can throw 30% critical avoidance on herself. You double that with the 35 she gets from her arrow. She's at 65% critical avoidance and even tankier than she was before. B2 actually doesn't have anything within his own kit, but how B1, who you're almost using the two of them together simultaneously, is going to be giving B2 50% critical avoidance roughly. It is dependent on how many stacks there are B1, but if you're at 100 stacks, it is 50% critical avoidance. So when you add in even more on top of it, you get a great gain. Also, B2 is another example of a character that just gains a lot of turn meter and doesn't necessarily need the speed to make up for it. So you can even see on him that this arrow flat out has no speed on it, like zero, none, zilch, nada. So Magna, you could actually probably throw into that category as well for the same reasons on the General Grievous team. So this one probably isn't going to be as popular, and I'm not saying everyone out there has to do it, but I found that it has been pretty helpful. And the reason why I'm not pushing it as hard as some of the other characters we've already listed on this is purely because the gains he gets outside of the critical avoidance arrow are really small. Rebel allies have 50% critical avoidance. That does include himself. It doesn't say other allies. It does include him. So you're up to about 50% critical avoidance with the arrow. But at the same time, if you were to use a health or even offense, that would probably be just fine. The reason why I'm okay with him being slower too is because he's constantly assisting at a turn for pretty much every single Rebel ally. And then he's certainly not a unique on a stick, but even if he was, he would be great unique on a stick through what his unique is doing, where he's going and sharing a lot of the leader's stats. Next up is going to be Darth Sion, again, a character who gets a lot of critical avoidance from Trey's lead, making him an even better tank. I actually do have him somewhat faster, but again, I would have this on him even if it was a 10 or 15 speed, much like a lot of the other characters that we've shown. This is just where one of my better mods ended up. So that is going to be it for critical avoidance. Again, non-exhaustive list. Let me know of other characters you can think of. Next up is going to be protection. And I didn't put JML on here, but let it be known, JML loves a lot of protection if you didn't already know that. Gungan Phalanx is going to be a great option on here. Many of my Gungans have some of my best mods because I love them. So he's got a 22 arrow there for protection primary, purely because he wants survivability, and he has a lot of really great ways of taunting. Next up is going to be Malik, who converts his protection into health, so he gets even better gains there and pretty much turns into a complete brick wall. I have essentially ditched tenacity on him entirely because Padme, Jedi, Anakin healing immunity isn't a common counter versus Sith Empire nowadays. K2SO is another good example of one that I really like a protection arrow on, even at the cost of a lot of speed, because not only does he get a boost from Adrads, Omicron, as well as has recovery from Adrad, he actually himself is actually a really minuscule amount. But at the same time, every single time he's damaged, he gains 1% max protection. So that's something. So again, good recovery, good max protection. And quite frankly, as a tank, he just doesn't need to cycle through a lot of turns like an attacker or a support would to be able to do damage to the enemy team, because K2 is not really your damage dealer at all. Marin. Perfect example. I'm actually a little bit embarrassed by the fact that her arrow has 16 speed on it, because speed means absolutely nothing for Marin. She only can move through bonus turn meter, which is great because that's how her entire kit is built. But because of the defense and potency and protection on it, I really didn't want to give it up. Or sorry, not potency, tenacity. Because overall, Marin has a lot of really good protection recovery, can't gain speed, as we said before, and the protection is really important, particularly against the Jabba, or for the Jabba counter, because thermals deal damage based off of max health, so a good way to make sure that she doesn't blow herself up is to guard her with a bunch of protection and tenacity, just to make sure that those thermals never even lands, and even if they do, to help curve them out a little bit. Next up is going to be General Skywalker. He is essentially a tank for the 501st in the sense that you have to get through him before you get to the clones. So the more survivability on him, the better. And the protection wall is actually what is going to do that. Not to mention the fact that he's going to get a boost on top of it once he enters the battle because of his unique ability. So overall, again, not exhaustive list, other characters out there, but that's 5 to really showcase the protection stat. Next up is going to be offense. And it's going to be a little bit different in the sense that this is the only stat that's offensive, because all the previous ones that we just looked at were much more defensively minded, except for, I guess, characters like General Grievous. So you'll actually see on here that I have given her an offense primary, and I've actually broken up the set because Fennec just wants offense that badly. And while it's not a very popular counter, if you are using Fennec Bam versus Lord Vader, you actually do want Fennec on the slower side, because there can be a really ugly interaction where Bam, when he goes and puts damage immunity on Fennec, he will draw back turn meter, and then if Fennec goes again and drops her damage immunity, you can actually open her up to being killed by Maul. So very niche, but at the same time, even if you're not doing that exact counter, Boss, Commando, Grief, they all call her into assist. She can get retribution too. So her actually needing to take turns to cycle through them isn't as important as her kicking someone in the face really stinking hard. Next up is going to be Qui-Gon. I am completely fine with dishing a lot of speed on his arrow for offense, because when he dies, that offense is given to all of his allies, and then Jedi Anakin goes boom. You've probably seen a short or two of mine where we've done that. It's always very fun. It's always very satisfying. Some people do like to have him really fast, just so that he can, if you're putting it on defense, so that he can go out and immediately do the buff dispel. And if you're fighting people who don't have several Qui-Gon Jinn counters, I guess that's fine. But even, I guess, kind of where I'm at, and maybe this is a bit elitist, like, that never does anything. Like, that's not going to matter. If Jedi Anakin uses an AoE in the very beginning of the battle with offense, DTMG just doesn't care. But anyways, maybe your Bad Batch is fast enough to get around it anyways. Next up is going to be Terran Malicos. And Terran Malicos is actually going to fit into a similar category as Sith Trooper as well, where the characters, they just assist so much out of turn. You don't really need to worry about them actually taking the turn, because they're going to be dealing damage in every other instance. So again, really good opportunity for an offense arrow here. He does still have 15 speed because why not? But I do like having him just a little bit slower because he can be, and because in the very beginning of the battle, you actually get a stat boost before anyone on your team takes a turn. Next up is going to be Bam. Very kind of similar reason to Fennec. We want to be bolstering his offense as much as possible, partly because Whistling Birds are actually going to be dealing completely true damage, meaning they can't crit at all. So really focusing a lot on offense on all of his stats is a really big deal. And he himself will take bonus turns when his Scoundrel allies go below a certain threshold, so he doesn't necessarily need to wait a turn to be able to get back around to it, and giving more time for the birds to actually collect might even be beneficial with an offense primary. And last but not least is going to be Sith Trooper. Again, very similar reasoning to that of Malicos. He doesn't necessarily have the nuances of before anyone on his team takes a turn because he's not under the Seer team, but at the same time, he's constantly assisting out of turn every single time one of his First Order or Sith ally crits. So focusing more on offense on his arrow, because he doesn't need to take a turn, because in kind of a way, he's already taking a turn every single time one of his allies goes and crits. Not to mention, I believe he also gets bonus turns or 100% turn meter whenever an ally dies, or whenever one of those specific ally dies, and then he can go ahead and use his big AoE. So there it is, 25 different examples of characters who are pretty much want a different primary than a speed arrow. Let me know in the comments if you can think of any others. But until the next time, happy mod hunting and stay awesome.